I've been seeing a lot of budget phones recently that claim to offer you the world. They make such bold claims about their amazing screens and their amazing cameras and their amazing battery and how the specs are absolutely ludicrous that they really make you wonder, if all of this was actually true, then why would anyone ever spend more than the $300 to $400 that they cost? And are flagship phones basically a scam? So let's find out. This is the top of the line, almost maxed out Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, which I bought for $1,379. And then this is, I think, the best spec affordable phone that's ever existed, the $349 Xiaomi Redmi Note 13 Pro Plus. Yeah, I could buy 4 of these phones for the price it would cost to buy 1 of these. So let's properly test every aspect of both phones to see how close or far the experience actually is. So as far as the unboxing goes, it's not a question of how close the Redmi can get to the Samsung, it's really how close the Samsung can get to the Redmi, the answer to which is not very close. This Note 13 Pro Plus, it comes with a matte black case included, a USB-C cable, and then I'm not even joking, 120 watt fast charger. Samsung literally just comes with a cable, so there's already additional cost that you're going to have to pay out. And even when you spend that money, you're still not going to get close to the charging speed of the Redmi, but more on that later. Let's start with the build. You would expect flagship phones to get you higher quality materials, right? And in a way, that is the case. The S23 Ultra comes with the very latest Gorilla Glass Victus 2. The Redmi comes with the prior generation Gorilla Glass Victus 1, which just requires a little bit less force to damage. The rim going around the Samsung is armor aluminium, which is a bit tougher than the more standard aluminium that you get on the Redmi. But really? That's it. Will 99% of people be able to tell any perceptible difference in quality? I don't think so. There's not a single bit of flexing or creaking on the Xiaomi. The vegan leather on the back, to me, feels just as high quality as the glass on the Samsung. And it passes the scratch test. I've rubbed keys against it, cards against it, phones against it, and it doesn't really pick up any wear and tear. These buttons on the side, they're cushioned, so they're really quiet to press, and just generally, the phone is way more comfy. It's got soft, rounded corners that don't dig into your hands like Samsung's sharp ones, and it's almost 15% lighter, which is light enough to feel liberating when you're coming from this to this, but not light enough to feel cheap. And yeah, flagship phones do tend to have IP68 water resistance, but so does the Redmi. So at 25% of the price, I would genuinely say the build and design you're getting is 95% as good, which is a very strong start. And then you turn the screens on, and you have to full-on check yourself, because this is where you would assume the difference would be immediately obvious. But the Redmi has not just a passable screen, or even a good screen. This is nearly as good as you can get. Both phones have a 120Hz max refresh rate, both are OLED panels, which keeps the contrast levels high, and both have basically infinite viewing angles. Samsung has a very slight blue tinge as you rotate, and Xiaomi has a very slight yellow tinge, but barely noticeable on either. Now, Samsung's display is a better display. Like, it's got the ability to be both higher resolution and brighter, but it's also a really good example of how nowadays the baseline is so good that you probably either won't notice the difference or you'll actually think the Xiaomi looks better. For example, in terms of resolution, the Samsung has a 1440 by 3088 display, which is 4.4 million pixels, compared to Xiaomi's max of 1220 by 2712, which is 3.3 million pixels. But here's the thing, Samsung, knowing how niche the need for that many pixels is, actually ships the phone set to 2316 by 1080, which is just 2.5 million. So while it can be sharper, the setting that it comes with, the one they recommend and therefore what most people are going to use it with, is actually less sharp. Exact same thing for brightness. While Samsung is capable of going brighter, that extra brightness is locked behind a separate setting that most people probably won't enable since it specifically warns you of the loss of battery if you do. And assuming you don't, the Redmi Note is actually the brighter of the two screens. The only meaningful advantage that the Samsung and any $1,000 plus phone screen will have is LTPO, which is a more advanced, more expensive bottom layer to the screen that lets it not just get its refresh rate super high, but also dial it down really low, like to 30 Hz when you're watching a video that's only refreshing 30 times per second, or 10 Hz on a fairly static web page. No budget phone has this tech, and so the lowest they're going to be able to go is 60. This doesn't actually have any impact on the screen quality, and so for screens, I'm going to say the Redmi is again 95% of the Samsung experience, but it should come into play with battery. As of now though, if this phone continues at this rate of being 95% as good, while also coming with everything you need in the box, then honestly it is on track to completely embarrass the flagships of this year. So then I thought, what's likely to be the weakest link of a phone like this? Where would they have most tried to cut corners? what about the signal? So I started by doing a Wi-Fi speed test. I went to 3 different locations, and in location 1, they were basically on par. Location 2, Samsung was edging out the Xiaomi, and then location 3, Xiaomi edged out the Samsung, meaning really there's nothing in it, unless you have some bonkers Wi-Fi speeds and you're reaching the ceiling of what this phone is capable of. So then I put a UK Vodafone SIM into both phones, went to 3 different spots again to test cellular speeds. I started with my desk, which sadly is a pretty low signal environment, and honestly, Samsung destroyed the Redmi. It had 2 times the download speed, almost 3 times the upload speed, faster across the board. In a medium signal environment though, it's about a draw. Samsung had higher download speeds and less latency, but Xiaomi's upload speed is clearly ahead. And this was consistent with what I found in the high signal environment, where Xiaomi's upload speed completely runs away with it, but Samsung has faster download and slightly less latency. And the real life experiences of these phones quite closely match what I found in that test. I found myself trusting the Samsung more when I get to those difficult, hard to reach places like the inside of an airplane. You will notice the Redmi signal dropping off faster, which is also not exactly surprising given that it has a less advanced 5G modem and almost definitely fewer antennae than the Samsung. Now, because of this, I was also expecting the Samsung to hit higher max speeds when you get to a city, but I guess the state of UK 5G right now is just not there. This might be different for some parts of the US, but largely speaking globally, I don't think you'll be getting close to the potential max speeds of either. So I would say the Redmi is 85% of the signal experience of the Samsung. What about battery then? For which I was fully expecting the Redmi to get demolished. I thought, well, past Redmi phones haven't exactly had the best battery, and also this is where the lack of an LTPO screen is gonna catch up with it. Well, there's 2 sides to battery. One is charging, for which it's not close. Samsung does have wireless charging, which the Redmi doesn't, but it's tough to argue against that phone's 120-watt charger that fully charges it in 20 minutes. Or in other words, 3 times faster than the absolute fastest that the Samsung can possibly charge with a charger that you'd have to then buy separately. But then the other side to this is how much life can you get out of that full charge? And this is where it swings the other way. Both phones are matched on paper with 5,000 mAh batteries, but I was running a side-by-side battery test of the 2 yesterday. I just basically pulled up YouTube and left them to it. And while the Samsung successfully reached the end of the day with 35% left, the Redmi was hanging on with 21, which is already a big difference. But then there's 3 further things in the Samsung's favor. One, that if you look really closely at the spec sheet, you'll notice that while both phones have the same capacity, they're actually using different battery technologies. Samsung with Li-ion, Xiaomi and most phones like it with Li-Poly. This is very easy to miss, but essentially Li-Poly is an older, cheaper type of tech that, while fast to charge, generally depletes faster and importantly degrades faster in the long term, which will likely be compounded by the second thing, the heat generated in Xiaomi's battery because of its ultra-fast charging. So 3 years in the future, the gap between these phones might be twice as big. And then 3, that the Samsung wastes less battery while on standby. The fact that it has a top-of-the-line Snapdragon chip means that, yes, its max power consumption will be higher when it's pushed, but it's also smarter than the mid-range chip in the Redmi, so it knows how to consume less power when it's not being pushed. As for how close that makes this battery category, well, it depends how you use your phone. I know people who constantly top up throughout the day, in which case you would weight the Redmi's fast charging more heavily. Me personally, I just want to charge my phone once overnight and then just trust that it's going to last, both during the day and then also in the long term. So for my uses, the Redmi's battery experience is a decent 25% behind what the Samsung is offering. And if you're enjoying this video, then a sub to the channel would be sensational. In terms of software then, I was surprised by this affordable phone. Xiaomi especially has a bit of a reputation with their cheaper phones for tons of ads and tons of bloatware. That's a big part of how their phones historically have been so affordable. With this, I've had neither of those 2 things. Now, whether that's because this is the China launch software as opposed to the international launch software that it will come with, or if Xiaomi views this actually as a premium phone, I don't know. But the point is, my software experience has been pretty great. The phone is running MIUI 14 based on Android 13, so it's up to date. All the animations in your day-to-day experience are smooth and beautiful and jiggly. It's got tons of customization options, everything from the way your phone responds to notifications to how your fingerprint scanner reacts as you press your finger onto it. And then the Samsung is running One UI based on Android 13, which I would describe as probably the more corporate of the two on the face of it, but at the same time, I do have a newfound appreciation for the sheer extent of customizability you unlock with Samsung's Good Lock app. It's probably the best you can do on Android without installing custom firmware. I mean, the actual software skin that you're going to get will depend on which brand of budget and flagship you end up going for, but the key point I'm trying to make here is that the software package you get on the affordable phone is the real deal. It's not missing anything. Where they diverge though is in the software support. The way to think about it is this: when you're selling a phone for $1,000 plus, you have far more room within that budget to justify spending the time required to keep that experience high level. And there's an incentive to, because anyone buying your $1,000 plus flagship, they are immediately one of your most valuable customers. So keep them happy and invested, and they'll keep spending on your services and your ecosystem products and your next flagship phones. So while with most companies you can expect 3 to 5 full years of updates after launch on their flagships, on the budget end of the spectrum, that's much more likely to be 2 years of updates, and you'll get those updates slower because you're considered a lower priority by that company. Now, this is important, but I also wouldn't overweight it. It's not like the moment an Android version comes out that you're not getting, your phone becomes garbage. No, your battery degradation, especially here, is much more likely to end up being the reason you switch than a lack of updates is. So I would say the software experience of the Redmi is again around that 85% mark compared to the very best. But you know what's not 85% as good? The performance. Alright, so spec-wise, the S23 Ultra here has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip, and by default it would have 8 gigs of RAM, but I bought the upgraded version with 12 gigs of RAM to match the 12 that comes by default in the Redmi. And then this Redmi, as well as the beefy 12 gigabytes of RAM, is powered by the Dimensity 7200 Ultra chip, which sounds amazing, right? The chip actually has Ultra in its name, so it's gotta be top level. Well, not really. In a very literal sense, if we run a Geekbench benchmark, the CPU on the flagship is about 2 times the performance of this phone, and the GPU is about 3 times. It's an order of magnitude more powerful on paper, but how much do you really feel that day to day? Well, when you're opening apps, Samsung is pretty significantly more responsive, probably partly the chipset and partly also the faster storage you get. It just feels like it's ready to load things at all times. Playing games, there's a big difference too. Like, just look at how much nicer this game looks on the Samsung. It's running at a higher resolution, it's running at a higher frame rate, and there are so many more effects on screen than the Xiaomi can handle. Xiaomi has a few more stutters when you do something the phone isn't expecting you to do, and you'll just generally notice it being sluggish when you're trying to do things that are considered pro-user tasks, like zooming in and out of a super high-res photo. So for me and my uses, there is a very clear speed gap. I'd say the Redmi is only 50% of the Samsung experience, but it does also depend on who's using it. If you're sticking to the basics, if you're looking for a phone to make calls, to browse the internet, to take some nice photos and then edit those photos for social media, then you're not going to come across the situations in which the differences are really noticeable. So you'll find it closer to 75%, 80% of the flagship experience. And we should talk about photos, because cameras are where tech companies seem to be spending the majority of their effort and spare budget. But when you don't have spare budget, how much are you giving up? Well, funnily enough, both of these phones have a 200 megapixel main camera. The Samsung's is a better 200 megapixel camera, but not by as much as you might think. Like, this is a 200 megapixel shot on each. Samsung is a bit less fuzzy, it's sharper, but only really because more sharpening has been applied. You could actually argue both ways which is actually the better photo. I've taken a lot of side-by-sides here, and when you're using the Redmi right, the difference between the two phones is really not what you think it should be. In a way, it's just a cool time to be alive, where an affordable phone can do this. And I was pretty shocked to see that at night, using the main camera, the gap is even smaller, sometimes actually tipping the other way, where I would say this $349 phone has taken a better photo than this $1,379 phone. Now, that shouldn't be the main takeaway here, but the point I'm trying to make is that the hardware is good enough here that if you learn how to use it well, to play to its strengths and skirt its weaknesses, the ceiling of what you can achieve is still super high. That said, there are a whole slew of reasons why it's much easier to get a great photo on a flagship. For starters, you'll get a proper hardware focusing system. Like the Samsung, for example, has a laser that just helps it lock onto things. So while sometimes when you get into lower light, this phone has to kind of hunt for focus, you don't need to worry here. And actually, all the cameras on flagship phones, they tend to be able to autofocus, which means you can use your ultra-wide camera to double as a macro camera for close-ups, instead of building an entirely separate camera on budget phones just for macro that will also happen to be much worse quality. The software processing on Samsung is more sophisticated. It understands faces and how to sharpen them, which is especially apparent when you're taking selfies, since that tends to be the focal point. Its portrait mode blur effect is more realistic to my eyes, and the zoom. I mean, Samsung has both a 3x and a 10x zoom lens. Affordable phones nowadays, they tend to have nothing, so they will get obliterated. Oh yeah, and if you ever want to properly expose a less good camera, try video, because video is hard. Stabilization matters much more with it, and it's also one of the first things that's skimped on to save costs. Video requires more hardware power to apply effects like noise reduction in real time, and it'll also be incredibly obvious with video when the focus dips, even if it's for a second. So in terms of the overall camera experience, I would say the Redmi is again 50% of what the Samsung is. It gets the single most important thing right, having a strong main camera that can capture great detail in all lighting, but loses just about every other luxury apart from that, as well as the USB 3.2 port that you tend to get on expensive phones, which lets you offload all of that footage you take very quickly. And together, all of this does add up to an experience that feels cheaper. So where does that leave us? Well, in most categories, this phone is a stark reminder of the diminishing returns that you can get when you spend more on a phone. It's actually wild that for 25% of the price, you can get something that very often feels like 80 to 90% of a phone. There are not many times in the tech world where I can say I've experienced that. And it's true for a lot of the more general quality of life things too, like the speakers. Samsung's a bit clearer and a bit louder, but just a bit. Samsung's in-screen fingerprint scanner is higher quality and its haptic motor is more expensive, but in practical use, you'll notice it to be a little better. The only outright thing that the Samsung has that this straight up doesn't is the S Pen, but that's more specific to the company as opposed to something that you just tend to get with flagships. So I would think of this Redmi as a surface level flagship. It's a flagship looking phone that I'd even go as far as to say functions and feels like a flagship until you try and be a power user with it, where you will start to feel a more real compromise in power, battery life, and camera versus a real one. So to answer our original question, there is a time and a place for more expensive phones, and it's when you need more of those things. But if you don't, then something like this is a very impressive sweet spot. Right, you record on that. Now, you might have noticed that ever since I first came across Surfshark VPN, I haven't used, touched, or even mentioned any other VPN, even though, trust me when I say, I've had higher offers to do so. It's pretty simple. Assuming that you're interested in a VPN, which for me has just been a peace of mind thing that you don't always need, but you never know when you'll need. Like, this Wi-Fi network seems a bit sus, so I better mask my identity while using it. Or I really fancy watching New Girl on Netflix, but it's not available on the UK version of Netflix, then Surfshark is a bit of a no-brainer. It's the most affordable good VPN out there. It doesn't just cover you or even you plus family, but you plus every single person you know. They have legit 24/7 customer support, ad and malware blockers baked into it, not to mention a ton of other nifty features, like if you install the Surfshark browser extension, then it can actually let you browse without websites asking you for cookies every 30 seconds. And right now, there is a Black Friday special. So using the code BOSS, you can get Surfshark VPN for less than $3 a month with up to 6 months for free, unlimited accounts, and a money-back guarantee.